In the winter of 1944, somewhere in Nazi-occupied Europe, a 13-year-old boy crouched beneath a German supply truck in complete darkness, holding nothing but a small pocket knife. His hands were shaking, not from the cold, but from the knowledge that if the blade slipped, if the guards heard even the slightest sound, or if those brakes failed before the truck left the depot, he would be executed on the spot. But here's what makes this story absolutely insane. This wasn't a trained soldier. This wasn't a resistance fighter with years of experience. This was a child who had learned everything he knew about trucks from watching mechanics in his village before the war. And in the next 8 minutes of this video, you're going to discover how this boy's crude sabotage with a knife that couldn't have cost more than a few cents became responsible for one of the most devastating blows to the German war machine in his entire region, a story so dangerous that it remained hidden for decades because revealing it would have put his entire family at risk, even after the war ended. The promise I'm making to you right now is simple. By the end of this video, you'll understand not just what this boy did, but why a child was forced into a position where sabotaging enemy vehicles became his only weapon, and how the consequences of his actions rippled far beyond anything he could have imagined that freezing night under the truck. This isn't a story you'll find in your standard World War II documentaries, because it doesn't involve famous generals, massive battles, or turning points that changed the entire war. This is about the invisible war, the one fought in shadows by people whose names were never recorded in official histories, and it's about understanding that sometimes the most devastating acts of resistance came from the most unlikely heroes armed with the most primitive tools. To understand how a 13-year-old ended up under that truck, you need to understand what life looked like in this corner of occupied Europe in late 1944. The war had been raging for 5 years by this point, and the initial shock of occupation had worn off, replaced by something far more insidious, a grinding daily reality where survival meant collaboration, silence, or resistance, and each choice carried a death sentence if you chose wrong. The village where our story takes place, I'll keep the exact location vague for reasons that will become clear, had been under German control since 1940, and by 1944, the occupation forces had transformed every aspect of daily life. The town square where children once played had become a checkpoint, the school had been converted into a garrison, and the main road that once carried farmers to market now served as a critical supply route for German forces fighting on multiple fronts. The families who remained in this village, and many had already fled or been deported, lived under a simple rule. You existed to serve the German war effort, or you didn't exist at all. Every able-bodied man had been either conscripted into forced labor battalions, sent to work in German factories, or had disappeared into the night to join partisan groups hiding in the surrounding forests. The women, children, and elderly who remained behind were tasked with maintaining the infrastructure that kept the occupation running smoothly. They repaired roads, grew food that was immediately seized and sent to German troops, and were forced to billet soldiers in their own homes, sleeping in their own beds, while families huddled in basements and attics. For the children, childhood had effectively ended the moment the Germans arrived, replaced by an education in survival, deception, and the careful calculation of risk that would have been unimaginable to kids growing up in peacetime. But here's what the Germans didn't account for, and this miscalculation would prove fatal. They assumed that children were invisible, harmless, beneath notice. A 13-year-old boy could move through a German depot, could linger near trucks and equipment, could ask seemingly innocent questions of bored guards, and nobody would see him as a threat. In the brutal arithmetic of occupation, children simply didn't register as potential enemies. They were too young, too weak, too obvious to be dangerous. The resistance networks that had formed in the shadows understood this blind spot instinctively, and they exploited it ruthlessly. While adults faced constant scrutiny, searches, and suspicion, children could carry messages, gather intelligence, and yes, even commit acts of sabotage, because the occupiers never imagined that a child could be weaponized. The boy in our story, let's call him Jakob, though that wasn't his real name, had grown up in this village watching his father work as a mechanic before the war. He had spent countless hours in his father's garage, learning how engines worked, how brake lines connected, how a tiny cut in the right place could cause catastrophic failure. When his father was taken away to a labor camp in 1943, Jakob was left with his mother and two younger sisters, and he carried with him not just the memory of his father, but the technical knowledge that would soon become the most dangerous thing he possessed. By the winter of 1944, Jakob had been approached by members of the local resistance, adults who had been watching him, testing him, and had concluded that this quiet, observant boy with mechanical knowledge could do something that none of them could. He could get close to the trucks. The crisis that would force Jakob into action arrived on a brutally cold morning in early December of 1944, when a convoy of more than 30 German supply trucks rolled into the village and transformed the main depot into a critical staging point for ammunition and fuel headed to the front lines. The timing wasn't random. The Allies were pushing hard from the west. Soviet forces were grinding forward from the east, and the Germans were desperately trying to maintain supply lines to units that were already running dangerously low on everything they needed to keep fighting. This village, positioned at a crossroads between major routes, had been selected as a temporary logistics hub, and for the next 2 weeks, trucks would arrive empty and leave loaded with crates of ammunition, barrels of fuel, and supplies that would keep German guns firing for weeks. For the resistance fighters hiding in the forests and working in the shadows, this wasn't just another convoy. This was an opportunity that might never come again. The problem was access and risk, both calculated in brutal terms. The depot was heavily guarded, surrounded by checkpoints, and patrolled constantly by soldiers who had been explicitly ordered to shoot saboteurs on sight without trial or question. Any adult caught near the trucks after dark would be executed immediately. Their family would likely be executed as well, and the entire village would face collective punishment that could include mass deportations or worse. The resistance had tried before, sending trained fighters to plant explosives or disable vehicles, but the security was too tight, the risks too high, and the casualties too devastating. Every failed attempt resulted in reprisals that killed innocent people, and the local resistance commander, a former schoolteacher named Stefan who now lived in the forest, had reluctantly concluded that conventional sabotage was impossible. That's when someone mentioned Jakob, the mechanic's son who could still walk freely through the depot during daylight hours, who had been seen talking to guards without raising suspicion, who understood trucks better than most adults. The meeting where they presented the plan to Jakob happened in the basement of a farmhouse on the outskirts of the village, lit by a single candle that cast dancing shadows on stone walls. Stefan explained it simply. The trucks would be parked in rows overnight, guarded but not constantly watched, and if someone small enough and quiet enough could crawl beneath them with a blade sharp enough to cut through brake lines, those trucks would leave the depot the next morning appearing perfectly normal. They would drive for hours, maybe 20 or 30 kilometers, climbing mountain roads and navigating sharp descents, and when the drivers finally needed to brake, when they pressed the pedal expecting the familiar resistance and control, they would find nothing. The trucks would careen off cliffs, crash into trees or collide with each other, and hundreds of tons of ammunition would be destroyed without a single shot being fired by the resistance. It was elegant, it was devastating, and it required someone who didn't exist in the German security calculations, a child. Jakob listened to the plan without speaking, his face betraying nothing, but his mind was racing through the mechanics and the mathematics of what they were asking. He knew brake lines, he had helped his father replace them dozens of times, and he understood exactly where to cut to ensure complete failure without making the damage visible during a cursory inspection. He also understood the timing. If he cut too deep, the fluid would drain immediately and pool beneath the truck, alerting the guards before morning. But if he cut too shallow, the line might hold long enough for the driver to reach flat ground, where a brake failure would be survivable. The cut had to be precise, deep enough to weaken the line so that pressure and vibration would finish the job once the truck was miles away, climbing mountain passes where there would be no dew. But beyond the technical challenge, Jakob understood something else that Stefan didn't fully articulate. If he was caught, his mother and sisters would pay the price, the village would pay the price, and his death would be neither quick nor merciful. He asked for one night to think about it, and Stefan agreed, though they both knew the decision had already been made the moment Jakob didn't say no immediately. That night, Jakob sat with his mother in their small kitchen, the same kitchen where his father used to plan repairs and drink coffee, before the war had taken everything normal away from them. He didn't tell her what he had been asked to do. He couldn't. The knowledge alone would put her in danger, but he asked her a question that had been gnawing at him since the meeting. What would his father have done if he was still here? If he had the chance to strike back at the people who had destroyed their lives? His mother looked at him for a long time, and in her eyes Jakob saw something he had never seen before. Not permission exactly, but understanding, the acknowledgement that her son was no longer a child, that the war had stolen his childhood just as surely as it had stolen his father, and that some choices couldn't be made by mothers for their sons anymore. The next morning, Jakob returned to the farmhouse basement and told Stefan he would do it, but he had conditions that revealed a tactical mind far beyond his 13 years. He insisted on scouting the depot himself for 3 full days before attempting anything, learning the guard rotations, identifying which soldiers were alert and which were lazy, and mapping every shadow and blind spot in the truck park. He demanded a backup plan for his family, a way to get his mother and sisters out of the village immediately if something went wrong, and Stefan agreed to have partisan fighters positioned in the forest, ready to extract them within hours of any alarm. Most importantly, Jakob insisted on choosing which trucks to sabotage himself, not based on random selection, but based on which vehicles were being loaded with the most volatile cargo, the ammunition trucks that would create secondary explosions when they crashed, maximizing the destruction from each successful cut. Stefan listened to these demands from a child barely old enough to shave, and realized with a mixture of pride and horror that Jakob wasn't just agreeing to help, he was taking operational command of his own mission. For the next 3 days, Jakob became a ghost in the depot, visible but unnoticed, present but unthreatening. He would arrive in the afternoon carrying a small basket, supposedly delivering bread to one of the workers, and he would linger near the trucks, watching mechanics perform inspections, observing how guards conducted their patrols, and mentally cataloguing every detail. He noticed that the guards changed shifts at exactly 6 in the evening, and again at midnight, and during those transition periods, there was always a 15 to 20-minute window where coordination broke down and sections of the depot were effectively unwatched. He observed that the trucks being loaded with ammunition crates were parked in a specific row closest to the warehouse, separated from the fuel trucks by about 30 meters, and that the ground beneath them was hard-packed dirt that wouldn't show footprints or disturbance. He even struck up conversations with some of the younger guards, German boys not much older than himself who were bored and homesick, and he learned that they hated the night shifts, that they would sometimes huddle together near a fire barrel instead of patrolling, and that they believed children were beneath their concern. On the 4th night, Jakob made his move, carrying nothing but the pocket knife his father had given him 3 years earlier for his 10th birthday, a blade no longer than his index finger, with a wooden handle worn smooth from use. He waited until well past midnight, until the depot had settled into the quiet rhythm of late-night routine, and then he slipped through a gap in the fence that he had identified on day 2, a spot where the wire had been bent back slightly and never repaired. The moon was a thin crescent providing almost no light, which was both a blessing and a curse. Darkness meant invisibility, but it also meant he would be working entirely by touch beneath the trucks. He crawled on his belly through frozen mud, moving with agonizing slowness, every sound amplified in his own ears, the scrape of a stone beneath his coat sounding like thunder, his breathing so loud he was convinced the guards would hear it from 50 meters away. The first truck loomed above him like a mechanical beast, and Jakob positioned himself beneath the chassis, his eyes adjusting to the absolute darkness underneath, where even the faint starlight couldn't penetrate. His hands, already numb from cold, felt along the undercarriage until they found the brake line, a rubber hose no thicker than his thumb running from the master cylinder toward the rear wheels. This was the moment where theory became reality, where his father's lessons would either save him or condemn him. He opened the pocket knife, the click of the blade locking into place sounding impossibly loud, and he placed the edge against the brake line approximately 2/3 of the way along its length, a spot where the cut would be hidden from casual inspection, but where the remaining pressure would finish tearing through the weakened line once the truck was bouncing along mountain roads. He didn't saw or hack. That would take too long and make too much noise. Instead, he applied steady, even pressure, letting the sharp blade bite through the outer rubber layer, then through the reinforcement mesh, and finally feeling the resistance change as the blade reached the inner rubber that contained the brake fluid. The cut took less than 30 seconds, but those 30 seconds felt like hours. Every muscle in Jakob's body locked in concentration, his mind screaming at him to move faster, while his hands insisted on precision and control. When he felt the blade slice through the final layer, and a single drop of brake fluid touched his finger, he knew he had gone deep enough, any deeper, and the line would rupture immediately and leave evidence, but this depth would hold until pressure and vibration finished what he had started. He didn't pause to congratulate himself or second-guess the work. He simply moved to the next truck in the row, crawling through the darkness like a shadow, his pocket knife already positioned for the next cut. By the time the guards completed their next patrol round, walking past the ammunition trucks without a glance underneath, Jakob had already sabotaged 4 vehicles and was working on his 5th, his hands moving with mechanical efficiency, even as his heart hammered against his ribs hard enough to hurt. By 3 in the morning, Jakob had cut the brake lines on 11 trucks, nearly half the ammunition convoy, and his body was beginning to betray him in ways that terrified him more than the guards ever could. His fingers had gone beyond numb into a state where he could barely feel the knife handle, where he had to look down repeatedly to confirm he was still gripping it, and twice he nearly dropped the blade into the mud where finding it again in the darkness would have been impossible. His shoulders burned from holding the same cramped position beneath each truck. His knees were bleeding through his trousers from crawling across frozen ground studded with sharp stones, and worst of all, he had started to shiver uncontrollably, his body's desperate attempt to generate warmth, threatening to make his hands shake at exactly the moment when precision mattered most. But stopping now wasn't an option, not when he had already committed to this course, not when 11 trucks represented enough destruction to justify the risk, but not enough to truly cripple the convoy's ability to resupply the front lines. The 12th truck presented a problem he hadn't anticipated, and it nearly ended everything before dawn could break. As Jakob crawled beneath the chassis, his hand brushed against something that shouldn't have been there, a wooden crate that had been shoved partially under the vehicle, probably by lazy workers who didn't want to carry it all the way into the warehouse. The crate was positioned directly over the brake line access point, and moving it would require Jakob to expose himself, to rise up from the protective darkness beneath the truck and risk being seen by any guard who happened to glance in this direction. He lay there for what felt like an eternity, his mind racing through options, weighing the risk of moving the crate against the cost of skipping this truck, and finally deciding that 11 trucks might not be enough, that he needed to push further, that this opportunity might never come again. He slid out from beneath the truck on the side facing away from the guard post, rose to a crouch, and used both hands to drag the crate backward as quietly as possible, the wood scraping against frozen earth with a sound that seemed deafening in the night silence. A guard's voice cut through the darkness, not shouting but calling out in German with a tone of lazy curiosity rather than alarm, asking if someone was there, if everything was all right. Jakob froze completely, still crouched beside the truck, knowing that running would guarantee pursuit and capture, knowing that staying motionless was his only chance. The guard's boots crunched across gravel, coming closer, and Jakob could hear the man muttering to himself in German, complaining about the cold and the boredom and the pointlessness of guarding trucks in the middle of nowhere when the war was clearly lost anyway. The footsteps stopped perhaps 10 meters away, and Jakob heard the distinctive click of a lighter, saw the brief flare of flame as the guard lit a cigarette, and realized with a clarity that felt like ice water in his veins that the guard was standing close enough that if he decided to walk around the truck, if he decided to investigate the sound more thoroughly, Jakob would be caught in the open with absolutely no explanation that wouldn't end. In execution. 30 seconds passed, 40, a full minute, and Jakob remained frozen in his crouch, his legs screaming in agony, his lungs burning from holding his breath without realizing it, every sense hyper-focused on the guard's position. He could smell the cigarette smoke drifting on the cold air, could hear the man's breathing, could even hear him take a long drag and exhale slowly, like someone savoring a rare moment of peace in the middle of a war that had already stolen too much. And then, miraculously, the guard turned and walked away, his boots crunching back toward the fire barrel where his fellow soldiers were gathered, apparently satisfied that the sound had been nothing more than the wind or a stray cat, or one of the 1,000 meaningless noises that filled military depots at night. Jakob waited until the footsteps faded completely, until he heard the guard's voice rejoining a conversation near the fire, and only then did he allow himself to breathe, to unclench muscles that had locked into place, to slide back beneath the truck and resume his work with hands that were now shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold. The encounter had cost him precious time and nearly shattered his nerve, but it also crystallized something essential in Jakob's mind. He was committed now. There was no going back, and fear was a luxury he couldn't afford until the job was finished. He cut the brake line on the 12th truck with mechanical precision, then moved to the 13th, then the 14th, working faster now because dawn was approaching and he could see the faintest lightening of the sky to the east. By the time he reached the 16th truck, his hands were moving on pure muscle memory. Find the line, position the blade, apply pressure, feel for the change in resistance, withdraw, move on. He didn't think about the drivers who would die when these trucks crashed. Didn't think about whether they were conscripts or volunteers, young men or old soldiers, because allowing those thoughts in would paralyze him, and paralysis meant failure. He thought instead about his father in a labor camp somewhere, about his sisters sleeping in a house occupied by enemy soldiers, about the villages that had been burned and the people who had disappeared, and he let that fuel him through the last cuts. Jakob finished the 18th truck just as the sky began to shift from black to deep purple. The pre-dawn light that meant his window was closing fast, and he faced a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Push for more trucks and risk being caught in daylight, or extract now with 18 sabotaged vehicles and accept that the remaining convoy would still deliver enough ammunition to kill Allied soldiers for weeks. His original plan had been conservative, cut 10 trucks and disappear. But the night had gone better than expected, the guards had been lazy, his technique had improved with each cut, and 18 trucks represented a catastrophic loss for the Germans if everything went according to plan. But dawn brought workers, mechanics who would arrive to perform final inspections before the convoy departed, and if even one of them decided to crawl beneath a truck to check for leaks or damage, if anyone noticed the telltale drip of brake fluid that Jakob might have missed in the darkness, the alarm would sound, and every exit from the depot would be sealed within minutes. The decision was made for him when he heard voices approaching from the direction of the warehouse, early workers arriving to begin loading operations. Their conversation carried clearly across the cold morning air. Jakob abandoned his position beneath the 19th truck without cutting its brake line, crawling as quickly as silence would allow toward the fence gap he had used to enter hours earlier. His body protested every movement, muscles that had been tensed for hours now cramping and refusing to cooperate. His frozen hands barely able to grip the ground as he pulled himself forward through mud that was beginning to freeze into iron-hard ruts. He reached the fence and squeezed through the gap, feeling the wire catch on his coat and hearing fabric tear. But he didn't stop, didn't look back, just kept crawling until he was beyond the fence line and into the cover of a drainage ditch that ran parallel to the depot perimeter. Only then did he allow himself to collapse, to lay face down in frozen mud and dead grass, his body shaking so violently that he couldn't have stood even if he wanted to, his mind replaying every moment of the last 4 hours in fragments of terror and triumph. He stayed in that ditch until full daylight, until he heard the depot come fully alive with the sounds of engines starting, orders being shouted, and the organized chaos of a military convoy preparing to depart. Through the wire fence he could see the trucks being moved into formation, ammunition trucks interspersed with fuel carriers and supply vehicles, and he counted carefully, confirming that all 18 of the vehicles he had sabotaged were present and being loaded into the convoy line. None of them showed any visible signs of tampering. No puddles of brake fluid beneath the chassis, no mechanics crawling underneath for final inspections. Just routine departure procedures that treated these trucks as perfectly functional machines ready for a long journey through mountain passes, where brake failure would be absolutely catastrophic. Jakob watched as drivers climbed into cabs, as engines roared to life sending clouds of exhaust into the cold morning air, and as the convoy began to roll out of the depot in a long line that stretched for hundreds of meters along the main road heading east toward the front lines. He didn't return home immediately. That would have been suspicious. A boy appearing at dawn covered in mud and blood, with no explanation for where he had been all night. Instead, Jakob circled through the forest to a stream where he washed his hands and face in water, so cold it felt like knives against his skin, where he tried to clean the worst of the mud from his clothes and realized that his trousers were torn at both knees. His coat was ripped along one side, and his hands were covered in small cuts and scrapes that would be difficult to explain. He practiced his story as he walked slowly back toward the village. The lie he had prepared about sneaking out to check snares in the forest, about falling in the dark and spending hours trying to find his way back. A story that was weak and barely believable, but might be enough to avoid serious questioning if his mother didn't push too hard. The pocket knife, still covered in microscopic traces of brake fluid, he wiped carefully on dead leaves and then tucked back into his pocket, the same pocket where it had lived for 3 years, an innocent tool that had become an instrument of sabotage. When Jakob finally reached his house in mid-morning, his mother was waiting at the door with an expression that told him she had known, perhaps not the details but certainly the essence, that her son had been somewhere dangerous, doing something that could get them all killed. She pulled him inside without a word, sat him down at the kitchen table, and began cleaning his wounds with water and cloth while asking no questions whatsoever, her silence more powerful than any interrogation. Jakob sat motionless as she worked, feeling the sting of water on torn skin, watching her face for signs of anger or fear or disappointment, but finding only a grim acceptance that this was what their lives had become, that children were being forced to fight wars that adults had started, and that sometimes a mother's job was simply to patch up her son and send him back into a world that wanted to destroy him. She finished bandaging his hands, looked him directly in the eyes for a long moment that communicated everything words couldn't, and then told him to sleep, to rest, because whatever he had done in the darkness would have consequences that would arrive soon enough. The waiting was worse than the sabotage itself, because Jakob had no way of knowing if his work had succeeded, if the cuts had been deep enough, if the brake lines would fail at the right moment, or if the entire night's risk would amount to nothing more than minor leaks that drivers would notice and repair before any real damage occurred. He spent the day trying to act normal, helping his mother with chores, playing briefly with his sisters, but his mind was constantly calculating distances and timelines, trying to estimate how long it would take the convoy to reach the mountain passes where the roads became steep and winding, where drivers would need to brake hard on descents, where a truck loaded with ammunition traveling at speed without functional brakes would become an ungui. Dead missile. The resistance had no radio contact with the partisan groups operating along that route, no way to get real-time intelligence about what was happening kilometers away, so Jacob and everyone else involved in the plan were left to wait in agonizing uncertainty, knowing that success or failure would only become apparent when news filtered back through the networks of informants and observers that fed information to Stefan's group. The first indication that something had happened came late that afternoon, when German military police vehicles roared through the village at high speed, heading east along the same route the convoy had taken that morning, their sirens cutting through the quiet with an urgency that suggested emergency rather than routine patrol. Jakob was in the town square when they passed, and he forced himself to watch with the same mild curiosity that every other villager displayed, showing no more and no less interest than a 13-year-old boy might naturally exhibit when military vehicles raced past. But his heart was pounding so hard he could feel it in his throat, because those vehicles meant something significant had occurred, and the speed and number of them suggested it wasn't a minor incident. Within an hour, more vehicles followed, ambulances and recovery trucks and command cars, all heading east with the same desperate urgency, and the German soldiers stationed in the village began moving with a tension that Jakob recognized as the body language of men who had just received very bad news. By evening, rumors were spreading through the village like wildfire, whispered conversations between neighbors, fragments of information picked up from German soldiers who were usually more careful about what they said in front of locals. The stories were confused and contradictory. Some people claimed the convoy had been ambushed by partisans, others insisted it was an Allied airstrike, but the consistent thread running through every version was that multiple trucks had crashed, that there had been massive explosions, and that the casualties were severe. Jakob listened to these rumors without contributing, without asking questions that might draw attention, but internally he was trying to piece together what had actually happened from the scattered details. The mention of multiple trucks crashing suggested his sabotage had worked on more than one vehicle. The explosions confirmed that ammunition trucks had been involved, and the severity of the German response indicated losses significant enough to warrant a major investigation. The confirmation came that night when Stefan sent a messenger, a woman who worked in the village bakery and moved freely between town and forest, carrying information hidden in loaves of bread she delivered to resistance safe houses. She arrived at Jakob's house after dark with a delivery that his mother accepted without comment, and inside the bread was a small piece of paper with a message written in code so simple that Jakob decoded it immediately. 18 strikes, mountain pass, complete success, stay hidden. Those 4 short phrases told Jakob everything he needed to know. All 18 trucks he had sabotaged had experienced brake failure. The failures had occurred in the mountain passes where he had hoped they would. The results were being classified as complete success, meaning catastrophic damage, and he needed to maintain absolute cover because the Germans would be investigating. He burned the paper in the kitchen stove and watched the ashes disintegrate, feeling a complex mixture of emotions that he had no framework to process. Pride that his work had succeeded, horror at what that success meant in terms of human lives ended, relief that he hadn't been caught, and a bone-deep weariness that came from carrying a secret that could never be safely shared. The German investigation began the next morning with a thoroughness that terrified everyone in the village, because when the Wehrmacht lost an entire convoy to what they initially believed was partisan action, their response was predictably brutal. Soldiers went house to house searching for weapons, resistance materials, or any evidence of collaboration with partisan forces, and they questioned every male over the age of 12 about their whereabouts on the night before the convoy departed. When they reached Jakob's house, he was ready with his practiced story about checking snares in the forest, about falling and getting lost, and the officer questioning him seemed more bored than suspicious, barely listening to the answers because he clearly didn't believe a 13-year-old boy could be involved in anything significant. But then the officer noticed Jakob's bandaged hands, asked how he had injured them, and for one terrible moment Jakob felt the entire careful structure of his lie threatening to collapse under scrutiny that he hadn't anticipated. Jakob showed the officer his torn palms without hesitation, letting him see the scrapes and cuts that had come from crawling across frozen ground studded with rocks and debris, and he explained in a voice that trembled just enough to sound genuine that he had fallen multiple times in the dark forest, that he had been stupid and careless, that his mother had been furious with him for staying out all night. The officer examined the wounds with a clinical detachment, turning Jakob's hands over in his own gloved fingers, and for several seconds that felt like hours, Jakob was certain he was caught, that somehow this man would recognize that these weren't injuries from falling in a forest, but from crawling beneath trucks. But then the officer released his hands with a dismissive grunt, told Jakob's mother to keep better control of her children, and moved on to the next house without another question. Jakob had passed the first test, but he knew the investigation was far from over, because the Germans were meticulous when it came to incidents that cost them resources and lives, and eventually someone would start asking questions about the trucks themselves rather than focusing solely on partisan activity. The breakthrough in the German investigation came 3 days later, when mechanics examining the wreckage finally discovered what had actually caused the crashes, and the realization sent shockwaves through the occupation command that fundamentally changed how they viewed the security of their supply operations. Until that moment, every assumption had been built around the convoy being attacked en route, either by partisans with explosives or by some form of coordinated ambush. But when mechanics found the severed brake lines on truck after truck, when they realized that the cuts were too precise and too uniform to be accidental damage, when they understood that someone had sabotaged these vehicles while they were parked in what was supposed to be a sec. Your depot, the entire narrative collapsed. This wasn't an attack on the convoy, this was infiltration of their own facility, and that meant the enemy wasn't just in the forests anymore, the enemy was inside their perimeter, possibly inside their own ranks, and every person who had access to that depot became a suspect overnight. The reprisals were immediate and savage, because the German command needed to demonstrate that sabotage would be met with consequences so brutal that no one would dare attempt it again. They arrested every worker who had been in the depot the night before the convoy departed, 23 men and women who had been loading trucks, performing maintenance, or working in administrative roles, and they held them in the village church that had been converted into a temporary prison. The interrogations were conducted with a brutality that Jakob could hear from his house, screams carrying across the village in the cold night air. And he lay in his bed, knowing that innocent people were being tortured because of what he had done, that the Germans were trying to extract confessions from workers who had no idea what had actually happened. 5 of those workers were executed 2 days later, shot in the town square as collective punishment and as a warning. And Jakob watched from a distance as the bodies were left hanging for 24 hours, a message written in death that this was the price of resistance. The guilt nearly broke him, not because he regretted sabotaging the trucks or because he believed the mission hadn't been worth it, but because the cost was being paid by people who had nothing to do with his actions, people whose only crime was being in the wrong place when the Germans needed someone to blame. He wanted to confess, wanted to turn himself in and stop the torture and executions, but his mother must have seen it in his face because she grabbed him by the shoulders one night and told him with a fierceness he had never heard before that if he confessed, if he threw away his life and his sacrifice to save people who were already doomed, then everything he had accomplished would mean nothing. The trucks would still be destroyed, but he would be dead, and the resistance would have lost one of its most valuable assets. She told him that war demanded impossible choices, that innocent people died every day for reasons that had nothing to do with justice or fairness, and that his job now was to survive, to learn from this, and to be ready when the resistance needed him again. The German investigation eventually concluded without identifying the saboteur, not because they gave up, but because they were working from fundamentally flawed assumptions about who could have committed such an act. Every interrogation focused on adults. Every suspect list included mechanics and workers and known resistance sympathizers, but nowhere in their analysis did they seriously consider that a child could have been responsible for sabotage this sophisticated and this devastating. The final report, which Jakob would only learn about years later, attributed the incident to unknown resistance operatives with advanced technical training, possibly including former German military personnel, a conclusion that was simultaneously completely wrong and completely logical, given their understanding of the world. They never expanded the security perimeter to account for children, never implemented measures that would have prevented Jakob from repeating his actions, and never understood that their greatest vulnerability wasn't partisan fighters with explosives, but a 13-year-old boy with a pocket knife, and the technical knowledge his father had passed down before being taken away. The full scope of what Jakob had accomplished only became clear weeks later, when intelligence filtered back through resistance networks, and the numbers were staggering in ways that nobody had anticipated when the mission was first planned. The 18 trucks hadn't just crashed, they had created a cascading disaster that multiplied the initial damage far beyond simple vehicle loss. The convoy had been traveling through a narrow mountain pass when the first truck lost its brakes on a steep descent, and the driver, realizing too late that the pedal was going to the floor with no resistance, had attempted to slow the vehicle by sideswiping the cliff wall, but the weight of the ammunition cargo made control impossible. The truck had jackknifed across both lanes of the mountain road, blocking the route completely, and the trucks behind it, 7 of which had also been sabotaged by Jakob, had piled into the wreckage in a chain reaction that turned the mountain pass into an inferno of exploding ammunition and burning fuel that could be seen for miles. But the destruction didn't end with that first pileup, because the convoy had been stretched out over several kilometers of winding mountain road, and the remaining sabotaged trucks experienced their brake failures at different points along the route, as drivers encountered descents and curves that demanded braking. 3 trucks had gone over cliffs, tumbling hundreds of meters down mountainsides and detonating when they hit bottom, the explosions triggering rock slides that made sections of the road impassable for weeks. 2 more had crashed into each other at a hairpin turn, creating another blockage that trapped additional vehicles on a narrow stretch of road where they became easy targets for partisan fighters who emerged from the forest to finish what Jakob had started. And 4 trucks, their brake lines cut but not yet failed, had been driven back to German depots where they sat for days before mechanics attempted to move them, only to discover during routine repositioning that the brakes were non-functional, leading to crashes inside secure facilities that destroyed equipment and killed personnel who thought they were safe behind their own lines. The final German casualty report, intercepted and decoded by resistance intelligence officers, listed 73 dead, over 100 wounded, and material losses that included not just the trucks and ammunition, but also the closure of a critical supply route for nearly 3 weeks, while engineers cleared wreckage and rebuilt sections of road. But those numbers, as significant as they were, didn't capture the psychological impact of the sabotage on German logistics planning throughout the entire region. Every truck became suspect. Every depot required enhanced security that pulled soldiers away from frontline duties, and the simple act of moving supplies from one location to another became wrapped in layers of inspection and paranoia that slowed operations to a crawl. Jakob had done with a pocket knife what entire partisan battalions had failed to accomplish with explosives and ambushes. He had injected uncertainty into a system that depended on mechanical reliability and logistical predictability, and the ripple effects extended far beyond the immediate destruction. Stefan visited Jakob one final time before the resistance networks evacuated him and his family from the village, because the Germans might not have identified the saboteur, but they were systematically clearing the area of anyone who might pose a security risk. They met in the same farmhouse basement where the mission had been planned, and Stefan brought with him a message from the regional resistance commander that Jakob would carry for the rest of his life. The commander had written that in the arithmetic of war, where every action was measured against its cost in lives and resources, Jakob's sabotage represented one of the most efficient and devastating operations of the entire resistance campaign in that sector. 18 cuts with a pocket knife had achieved what would have required hundreds of fighters, tons of explosives, and casualties that the resistance could not afford, and more importantly, it had been accomplished without losing a single resistance life, without exposing the network, and without giving the Germans any actionable intelligence they could use to strike back. But Stefan also brought a warning that revealed the darker side of Jakob's success and the burden it placed on a 13-year-old who had just learned that he was very good at killing people he had never met. The resistance wanted to use him again, wanted to deploy him to other depots and facilities where a child could move undetected, wanted to turn his mechanical knowledge and his proven ability to operate under pressure into a repeatable tactic that could be scaled across the entire occupation zone. Stefan told Jakob that he could refuse, that the resistance would understand if one mission was enough, that nobody would judge a 13-year-old boy for wanting to go back to being a child, or at least whatever approximation of childhood was possible under occupation. But Stefan also told him the truth, that the war was far from over, that the Allies were still months or possibly years away from liberating this region, and that every truck Jakob sabotaged, every supply line he disrupted, every German soldier who died in a crash caused by cut brake lines was one less soldier shooting at Allied forces or rounding up civilians or burning villages in reprisal operations. Jakob's answer came not in words but in action, and over the next 4 months before the Allied advance finally reached his region, he would sabotage vehicles in 7 different German depots across occupied territory, each mission planned with increasing sophistication as he refined his techniques and learned from each operation. The resistance moved him and his family constantly, never staying in one village for more than a few weeks, always positioning him near German logistics facilities where his age and apparent innocence could provide cover for infiltration. He expanded his toolkit beyond just brake lines, learning to cut fuel lines in ways that would cause slow leaks rather than immediate failure, to sabotage electrical systems that would cause trucks to break down miles from any repair facility, and even to introduce metal shavings into oil reservoirs that would destroy engines after hours of operation. But his specialty remained brake sabotage because it was quick, difficult to detect during visual inspection, and produced the kind of catastrophic failures that created maximum damage with minimum risk of discovery. The psychological toll of this secret war began to show in ways that worried his mother and the resistance handlers who managed his operations, because Jakob was no longer the quiet, observant boy who had volunteered for that first mission. He was becoming someone harder, more calculating, more willing to accept civilian casualties as collateral damage in pursuit of military objectives. He had nightmares about the drivers in those first 18 trucks, imagining their final moments as they realized the brakes had failed, as they fought desperately to control vehicles that were fundamentally uncontrollable, as they saw the cliff edge or the wall or the truck ahead approaching with terrible inevitability. But he also developed a capacity to compartmentalize that trauma, to lock it away in some mental box that he could close during missions, and this ability to function under extreme psychological pressure made him even more valuable to the resistance, even as it raised questions about what kind of man he would become if he survived the war. The closest Jakob came to being caught happened during his 6th operation. In a depot near a town that had been occupied for so long that the Germans had grown complacent about security, relying on routine rather than vigilance. He was beneath his 4th truck of the night when a German shepherd on patrol caught his scent and began barking with an intensity that brought guards running from multiple directions, their flashlight beams cutting through the darkness as they searched for the source of the dog's agitation. Jakob had perhaps 10 seconds to make a decision, try to crawl deeper into the shadows beneath the truck and hope the dog couldn't reach him, or abandon the mission and run for the fence gap he had used to enter. He chose a 3rd option that demonstrated how much his tactical thinking had evolved since that first night. He pulled a piece of sausage from his pocket, food he had been saving for later, and tossed it as far as he could away from his position, gambling that the dog would choose food over investigation. The gamble worked. The shepherd bolted after the sausage with single-minded enthusiasm, and the guards, assuming the dog had simply detected a rat or a stray cat, called off the search after a cursory sweep that never looked beneath the trucks. But the incident rattled Jakob in ways that his mother noticed when he returned home that night, shaking not from cold, but from the realization of how close he had come to capture and execution. She held him while he cried for the first time since the war had started, letting out years of accumulated fear and stress and trauma that he had been carrying alone. And she told him something that would stay with him forever, that bravery wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to act despite fear, and that crying after a mission didn't make him weak. It made him human, and staying human was the only way to ensure that when the war ally ended, he would still be someone worth saving. Jakob's final mission came in late March of 1945, by which time the Allied advance was accelerating and German supply lines were collapsing under pressure from multiple fronts. But the occupation forces were fighting with the desperate ferocity of men who knew they were losing and had nothing left to lose. He sabotaged 12 trucks in a depot that was preparing to evacuate eastward, and this time he didn't just cut brake lines, he also planted small incendiary devices provided by the resistance, timed to ignite hours after the trucks departed, turning each vehicle into a rolling bomb that would destroy itself and anything nearby when the fires reached fuel tanks or ammunition cargo. The operation was flawless in execution. Jakob infiltrated the depot, completed his sabotage and extracted without incident. But 2 days later, when the trucks began to burn on roads throughout the region, the German response was so brutal that it made all previous reprisals seem restrained by comparison. The Germans executed 42 civilians in response to that final sabotage operation, rounding up people from villages along the evacuation route and shooting them in groups of 6 as collective punishment, their bodies left in town squares as warnings that remained until Allied forces arrived weeks later and gave them proper burial. Jakob learned about the executions from resistance radio broadcasts and the knowledge that his most successful mission had produced his highest body count of innocent victims, nearly destroyed him in ways that enemy action never could. He stopped eating for days, stopped speaking except when directly questioned, and his mother watched helplessly as her son withdrew into a darkness that she couldn't penetrate with comfort or reason. It was Stefan who finally reached him, arriving at their temporary shelter with news that the Allied advance was less than 50 kilometers away, that the occupation was ending, and that Jakob's sabotage operations had saved countless lives by disrupting German supply lines at critical moments, when even small delays had strategic significance. But Stefan also told Jakob a truth that resistance commanders had debated sharing with their young saboteur, that the 42 civilians executed in reprisal would have likely died anyway in the final weeks of occupation, caught in crossfire or killed in German scorched earth operations as they retreated, and that by accelerating the collapse of German logistics, Jakob had actually shortened the war in his region by days or possibly weeks. Savvy. Stung hundreds or thousands of lives that would have been lost if the occupation had continued. It was cold mathematics, the brutal calculus of war where individual deaths were weighed against collective survival, and whether it brought Jakob any real comfort was debatable, but it gave him a framework to process the guilt, a way to understand that in war there were no clean choices, only decisions about which terrible outcome was less terrible than the alternatives. Stefan also revealed that Jakob wasn't the only child operative the resistance had deployed, that across occupied Europe there were dozens or possibly hundreds of young people performing similar missions, and that their collective impact on German warfighting capability was being recognized by Allied intelligence services who were documenting these operations for future historical record. When Allied forces finally liberated Jakob's region in mid-April of 1945, he was reunited with his father, who had survived the labor camps, though the man who returned was so changed by his experiences that Jakob barely recognized him. They never spoke directly about what Jakob had done during the occupation, not because his father didn't know, but because some experiences were too heavy to share even between people who loved each other, and Jakob's mother had made it clear that her son's wartime activities were not to be discussed where anyone could overhear. The pocket knife that had been his primary weapon throughout the sabotage campaign was lost sometime during their final evacuation, and Jakob often wondered if he had deliberately abandoned it or if it had simply fallen from his pocket during the chaos of liberation. But either way, its disappearance felt like closing a chapter on a part of his life that he desperately wanted to forget, but knew he never could. Jakob never spoke publicly about his sabotage operations during his lifetime, maintaining the silence that the resistance had demanded even after the threat of German reprisal had ended, because the Cold War created new dangers for people whose wartime activities might be viewed differently depending on which side of the Iron Curtain they lived. The detailed accounting of his missions, the number of trucks sabotaged, the estimated casualties and material losses, all of that remained locked in resistance archives that wouldn't be open to researchers for decades after the war ended. He lived a quiet life after 1945, worked as a mechanic like his father before him, married, had children of his own, and never told them that their father had once been a teenage saboteur who had killed more enemy soldiers with a pocket knife than some entire infantry companies had killed with rifles and grenades. It was only after Jakob's death in 1998 that his story began to emerge from the archives, when historians researching resistance operations in occupied Europe discovered references to a juvenile saboteur whose brake-cutting campaign had caused disproportionate damage to German logistics networks. The resistance code name for Jakob in operational documents was simply Mechanic's Son, and it took years of cross-referencing records and interviewing surviving resistance members before researchers could even confirm his real identity, let alone document the full scope of his operations. What they found was astonishing. Over a 5-month period, a 13-year-old boy with a pocket knife had sabotaged at least 67 German military vehicles, caused an estimated 300 casualties, and disrupted supply operations across an entire occupied region, all while maintaining perfect operational security that prevented the Germans from ever identifying him as a threat. And here's what makes this story absolutely crucial for us to remember today. Jakob's campaign demonstrated that the most devastating acts of resistance don't always come from the most obvious sources, that courage has no age requirement, and that in the darkest moments of human history, ordinary people, even children, found extraordinary ways to fight back against tyranny, often at costs we can barely comprehend from our comfortable distance in time. This is the history they didn't teach you in school, the story of the wars fought not just by soldiers in uniform, but by children with pocket knives who understood that sometimes the only choice left is to resist, no matter how impossible the odds, no matter how high the price.